After years of wandering beneath relentless skies, a nation finally stood still. Not because the journey was over, but because the next step would change everything. Their greatest leader had fallen, yet the promise spoken long ago still echoed through the camp like distant thunder. Before them flowed a river impossible to cross. Beyond it stood cities fortified, giants towering, and lands claimed by fear. But destiny does not wait for comfort. It calls the willing, the faithful, and the courageous to rise when uncertainty fills the air. A new leader would emerge, not crowned by men, but appointed by purpose, carrying the weight of history and the hope of generations. Waters would part once more, not for escape this time, but for inheritance. Steps of obedience would become footsteps into promise. Battles would shake the earth, walls would fall without a hammer, and victories would reveal that strength was never merely in numbers, but in covenant. This is the story of transition after loss, courage before conflict, and faith that walks forward when the outcome cannot yet be seen. 12 movements, 12 chapters of destiny unfolding, from the river's edge to the division of lands, from warfare to legacy. The question was never whether the promise existed. The question was always who would rise and step into it. For the pattern is documented, repeated, and unfolding now in the sight of all nations. The era of fulfillment is at hand. Yahuwah has always warned the nations, scattered his people for correction, and preserved them through suffering. But the appointed time of restoration is no longer a distant whisper. It is the thunder at the door. From the Torah to the restored books, the message is unified. The crossing has begun. We must see with the eyes of the prophets to understand the events of our day. History is merely the confirmation of his word. Walls of fear are tall, but they are not eternal. Only the covenant stands when the earth shakes. Step by step, the legacy is reclaimed, not by might nor by power, but by the breath of the Most High. Rise, for the river is parting. The inheritance is before you. The promise is yours to claim. This is the era of fulfillment. This is the moment history has waited for. 12 chapters, one destiny, one warning, one promise, one Yahuwah. Walk forward. The crossing is now. Shalom. In the stillness that followed the passing of Moshe, a silence settled over the camp of Israel like the hush before thunder. The man who stretched his staff over the sea, who climbed the mountain wrapped in fire, who spoke with the Most High as one speaks with a friend, now rested with his fathers. The desert wind moved across the tents, carrying both grief and expectation. A chapter had ended, but the story of promise had not. The people stood at the threshold of inheritance, yet their hearts trembled. Leadership had changed. The wilderness years had hardened them, refined them, tested their faith like gold in a furnace. Before them flowed the Yarden River, not merely water, but a boundary between wandering and possessing. Then the voice of Yahuwah came to Yahusha, son of Nun, not by ambition, not by popularity, but by appointment. Be strong, be courageous, do not fear, do not be dismayed, for Yahuwah, your Elohim, is with you wherever you go. These words echoed like thunder across destiny. Strength was not optional. Courage was not a suggestion. It was a command. Victory would not begin with swords drawn. It would begin with hearts aligned. Yahusha was instructed to meditate on the Torah day and night, for success would flow from obedience, not mere strategy. Officers moved through the camp. Preparations began. Families whispered of vineyards not planted by their hands and cities whose stones they did not lay. The promise given generations before now stood like a door waiting to be opened. Yet before armies marched, wisdom moved quietly. 2 spies were sent toward Jericho. Within its fortified walls lived a woman named Rahab, a name overlooked by men, yet remembered by heaven. Rahab had heard the stories, the sea divided, the wilderness provision, the victories beyond the river. Fear filled her city, but faith filled her heart. She recognized the sovereignty of the Elohim of Yisrael. When soldiers searched the streets, Rahab hid the spies upon her roof. Courage appeared in an unexpected place. Mercy began in an unlikely home. In exchange for her faith, she was given a scarlet cord to hang from her window, a sign that judgment would pass over her household. That scarlet thread swayed in the wind like a whisper of redemption. In a city destined for collapse, one household stood under promise. Deliverance was offered before destruction fell. Back in the camp of Israel, anticipation grew, leadership was established, faith had been witnessed. The people were no longer merely survivors of the wilderness, they were inheritors of covenant. Destiny does not belong to the hesitant. It belongs to those who step when called, who trust when uncertain, who move when the path seems impossible. Strength is quiet, courage is steady. Both are born from trust in the unseen hand that guides the visible journey. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and the river reflected gold across its surface, the tribe stood poised between memory and miracle. The wilderness chapter closed. The promise stood within reach. The journey into inheritance had begun. Yahweh has always warned the nations, preserved his people through suffering, and promised restoration at the appointed time. The journey continues. Dawn rose over the banks of the Yarden, and the people of Israel stood facing waters that whispered of impossibility. The river was swollen, its current fierce, its depth unknown, yet the command had already been spoken. They would cross, not by bridge, not by boat, but by faith, not soldiers, not scouts. The presence of Yahuwah led the way. The Ark of the Covenant, carried upon the shoulders of the priests, moved forward first. The people watched in silence, knowing that their victory would not begin with force, but with obedience. As the feet of the priests touched the river's edge, the waters recoiled as if creation itself remembered its maker. The current halted, the river stood upright like a wall, and the ground beneath became dry. What once roared, now bowed. Tribe by tribe, family by family, the nation walked through. Sand that had never known sunlight now felt the weight of destiny. The impossible had become a pathway. This crossing was not merely physical, it was spiritual. The wilderness mindset was being washed away. Fear that once clung to their identity dissolved with every step forward. 12 men were chosen, one from each tribe, to lift stones from the midst of the river. Not for construction, not for defense, but for remembrance. Memory would become their monument. When the final foot left the riverbed, the priests stepped onto the opposite shore. The waters surged back into place, roaring once more as if nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. The stones were stacked upon the land at Gilgal. 12 witnesses of divine intervention. Children would ask and fathers would answer. Generations would look upon those stones and remember that Yahuwah makes roads where none exist. Yahusha declared that this act would echo through time, not for pride, but for reverence. The crossing was a testimony that the Elohim who parted the sea still moved among his people. Nations heard of the miracle, and their courage melted. When the presence of Yahuwah moves, it does not whisper. It thunders across lands and hearts alike. The people camped in the land promised to their fathers. The wilderness no longer defined them. Their identity shifted from wanderers to heirs, from survivors to possessors. And so the river flowed once more, but its secret had been revealed. Creation itself yields when heaven commands. The journey forward would demand battles, but the first victory had already been won without a single sword drawn. The pattern is documented. The restoration is promised. Yahuwah has spoken. Memory is our monument. The legacy continues. The winds shifted across the plains of Gilgal, and the nations beyond the hills felt a tremor in their courage. Word had spread like wildfire. The river had parted, and a people once wandering now stood within their inheritance. Fear settled upon distant kings, but within the camp of Israel, a different work began, not of war, but of consecration. Before walls would fall and battles would rise, the hearts of the people were called into alignment. Covenant was remembered. Identity was restored. The mark of belonging, long neglected in the wilderness, was renewed among the sons of Israel. Pain was endured, yet purpose was restored. Destiny is not rushed, it is refined. Days passed in stillness. No marching, no weapons drawn. Only healing, reflection, and preparation. The land ahead required strength, but strength without obedience is hollow. The reproach of the wilderness was rolled away at Gilgal. The name itself became a declaration, a turning point where shame was removed. The people were no longer defined by their past wandering, but by their present calling. Identity was reclaimed. Then came the Passover upon the plains of Jericho. The memory of deliverance returned like a sacred melody. Unleavened bread was eaten. Ancient instructions were honored. The story of rescue was spoken once more beneath the open sky. On the day after the Passover, manna ceased. The bread that fell from heaven no longer appeared upon the ground. The season of miraculous provision shifted into a season of cultivation. They would now eat from the fruit of the land itself. This transition marked more than a dietary change. It was the closing of an era. Childhood faith was giving way to mature stewardship. The hand that once fed them daily was now teaching them to sow, reap, and govern in the land of promise. As twilight approached, Yahusha walked near the outskirts of Jericho. The city loomed ahead, walls thick, gates sealed, watchmen alert. The air carried the weight of impending confrontation. Yet what he encountered was not an army of men. Before him stood a figure, radiant, armed, unwavering. A warrior whose presence silenced the earth itself. Yahusha asked, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The question of allegiance hung in the heavy air. The answer came like a blade drawn from eternity. "No, but as commander of the army of Yahuwah, I have now come." Yahusha fell upon his face in reverence. Sand met forehead, pride met humility. The ground beneath him was declared holy. The conquest ahead would not be won by strategy alone, but by submission to divine command. The commander had arrived. Heaven had stepped onto the battlefield, and history held its breath. The turning point had come. The city of Jericho stood sealed like a clenched fist against the horizon. Walls layered upon walls, gates barred, watchmen vigilant. Within those stones lived fear disguised as strength. Outside those stones stood a people guided by a voice unseen. No siege engines were built, no ladders were raised. The strategy given was unlike any known to warriors of the earth. The command was simple yet confounding. Walk. For 6 days, the tribes of Yisrael circled the city once each day. Priests bore the ark. Trumpets carved from ram's horns pierced the morning air. The people remained silent. Not a shout, not a whisper, only footsteps and wind. The citizens of Jericho watched from their towers with confusion turning to unease. Mockery faded into dread. For silence can be louder than thunder when heaven is at work. Each circuit was an act of faith, a declaration that obedience is a weapon unseen, yet undefeated. The ground beneath their feet became a drumbeat of destiny. On the 7th day, the command shifted. The sun rose with urgency in its light. The people would not circle once, but 7 times. Repetition became revelation. Persistence became proclamation. Around the city they marched, once, twice, 3 times, the rhythm unbroken. Dust rose beneath sandals. Trumpets echoed against stone. The air thickened with anticipation as heaven and earth seemed to lean closer. Upon the 7th circuit, the silence was broken. Trumpets roared. Voices rose like a tidal wave. The shout of the people was not mere sound. It was agreement with a promise spoken long before their generation breathed its first breath. The walls trembled. Stone groaned against stone. What had stood for generations collapsed in moments. Not by force of arms, but by the authority of obedience aligned with heaven's decree. Amid the dust and thunder, one section of wall remained untouched, the dwelling of Rahab. The scarlet cord still hung in her window like a banner of mercy. Judgment fell, but promise stood. The city was overtaken, yet strict instruction governed the victory. Silver, gold, and sacred vessels were devoted, not seized. This conquest was not for greed, but for covenant. Discipline guarded blessing. As smoke ascended and echoes faded, the lesson was carved into history. Walls fall when faith walks. The impossible yields when obedience persists. And the shout of a people aligned with Yahuwah carries the power to reshape the earth itself. Victory at Jericho had echoed like thunder across the land, yet triumph carries a hidden test. For even after walls fall, the heart must remain guarded. Among the spoils, one man reached for what was forbidden. In that quiet act of greed, the seed of sorrow was planted. His name was Achan. What seemed small in the eyes of men was weighty before heaven. Secrecy is no shield from the one who sees all. Unaware of this breach, the army of Yisrael marched toward Ai with confidence. The city appeared small, yet confidence without discernment is a fragile shield. The battle turned swiftly. Warriors who had seen walls crumble now fled before a lesser city. Hearts melted and courage faltered. Questions rose like smoke. How had victory become defeat? Yahusha fell upon his face before the ark. He sought understanding in the twilight. The answer came not as comfort, but as correction. The covenant had been violated. An unseen breach had opened the door to visible loss. Tribe by tribe, the truth emerged. Hidden things were brought into the light by the hand of Yahuwah. Achan's trespass was revealed, and the weight of consequence fell heavy upon him. The lesson was carved deeply into the nation's memory. Obedience is not partial, it is whole. When the camp was cleansed and hearts were humbled, the strategy for Ai was given anew. This time, wisdom accompanied courage. An ambush would be set. Patience would partner with faith. Under the cover of night, 30,000 moved into position behind the city. Silence returned. At dawn, Yahusha and the main force approached openly. The king of Ai saw an easy victory. Pride opened the door that wisdom had closed. The gates were left wide as they pursued. Then the signal was given. From behind the city, the ambush rose like a tide. Flames climbed the walls. Smoke pierced the sky. The pursuers turned to see their stronghold consumed. The battle was swift and decisive. What had once been defeat became redemption. Yahusha stretched his spear toward the city until victory was complete, a gesture of unwavering resolve. In the aftermath, an altar was built upon Mount Ebal. Stones were raised and sacrifices offered. The Torah was read aloud before all the people. Blessings and warnings echoed between the mountains, reminding every generation that inheritance is preserved not by might alone, but by obedience. Alignment with the voice of Yahuwah is the only path to the promise. As the victories of Yisrael spread across the land, fear traveled faster than armies. Kings gathered in whispers. Alliances formed in shadows, and cities sought survival by cunning rather than confrontation. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some are waged with deception. From the city of Givon came envoys clothed in worn garments. Carrying cracked wineskins and dry bread, their appearance spoke of long journeys and distant lands. Yet their destination was only days away. Wisdom was tested not by force, but by discernment. They spoke of peace and distant homelands. The leaders of Yisrael examined their provisions. They observed their clothing and judged by sight. But one thing was neglected. They did not inquire of Yahuwah. A covenant was made, oaths were spoken, hands were clasped. Only later did the truth surface. The strangers were neighbors, their poverty a disguise. Murmurs filled the camp, yet the oath stood firm. Integrity would not be broken even when wisdom had faltered. The Givonites would live, not as equals in power, but as servants within the covenant. Soon, 5 Amorite kings rose in fury against Givon. Armies marched beneath darkened skies. The valley trembled with the sound of gathering steel. What began as deception now summoned a greater confrontation. Yahusha led his warriors through the night, ascending rugged paths beneath starlight. Fatigue pressed upon them. Purpose drove their steps. Before dawn, they stood ready, not merely for battle, but for intervention. As the conflict erupted, the hand of heaven moved once more. Hailstones descended from the sky, striking the adversaries with precision. Nature itself answered the command of Yahuwah. The battlefield became a theater of divine authority. Yet the day was not long enough for complete victory. The sun began its descent. In that moment, Yahusha spoke words that would echo through eternity. A command not to men, but to the heavens. Sun, stand still over Givon. Moon, remain over the valley of Ayalon. And the celestial lights paused in their courses. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Heaven aligned with earth's petition. The extended day allowed the pursuit to continue. The victory was secured, and the enemy's strength dissolved. No chronicle of kings could contain such a moment. Creation had responded to the voice of faith. When the sun at last resumed its journey, the lesson remained. Wisdom must seek divine counsel. Promises must be honored. When heaven moves, even the rhythm of the cosmos can pause to fulfill a purpose greater than time itself. News of Ai and Givon traveled swiftly across Canaan. Fear rippled through the hearts of kings and cities alike. Yet Yahusha's campaigns were not driven by vengeance, but by the mandate of Yahuwah, to fulfill promises made to the fathers and to establish his covenant upon the land. The southern kings gathered, their forces numerous, their chariots glinting beneath the rising sun. Yet heaven's strategy does not rely on numbers, but on obedience, timing, and divine direction. Yahusha marched with measured authority, leading his men with patience and precision. Every encampment was calculated. The people moved not as a mob, but as a disciplined instrument of covenant fulfillment. Cities fell, walls crumbled, and kings fled before the hand of Yahuwah. Fire consumed what was devoted. Silence reigned over the conquered lands. The victories were swift, yet each bore weighty lessons. Judgment and mercy walk hand in hand. Following the southern campaigns, Yahusha turned north. The terrain shifted from fertile valleys to rugged hills. Armies that thought themselves secure now faced the authority of heaven. The northern kings, joined in alliance, marched against the Israelites, but the strategy was not to confront them head-on, to execute maneuvers guided by faith. Ambushes, encirclements, and divine timing transformed weakness into triumph. Victory after victory, the lands were subdued. Each fallen city was recorded as testimony of the faithfulness of Yahuwah. This was not conquest for glory, but conquest for covenant, ensuring promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were fulfilled. Yahusha assembled the leaders of the tribes and recounted every campaign. Stones were set up, boundaries were drawn, and memorials were established. History was preserved in collective memory. The people were reminded that obedience brings inheritance, while disobedience brings calamity. Each act of faith, each step in alignment with heaven's mandate, secured the land for generations to come. Yahusha reviewed the kings defeated, 31 monarchs in total, and proclaimed the sovereignty of Yahuwah. Human power bows before divine authority. Armies falter where heaven moves. As the dust settled over the plains, hills, and valleys of Canaan, a new chapter in history began. The land was possessed, not by might alone, but by covenant obedience. The promise now unfolded into reality. And so the lesson stands. Divine purpose guides destiny. Obedience, faith, and reverence secure inheritance. Victory is not measured by the fallen walls alone, but by the hearts aligned with Yahuwah. The Elohim of all creation has fulfilled his word. The inheritance is won, for the memory of the fathers and the hope of the children. A covenant established for eternity. The years of conquest gradually gave way to seasons of settlement. The clang of weapons softened into the rhythm of cultivation, and the dust of battlefields settled into the soil of inheritance. The land, once promised, now awaited division among the tribes of Yisrael. Yahusha, now advanced in years, yet unwavering in spirit, stood before the leaders and elders. His voice carried both strength and tenderness, a reminder that victory is not merely won, it must be stewarded. Boundaries were drawn, territories assigned, and cities designated. Hills, valleys, rivers, and plains became the heritage of families who once wandered without a home. What had been spoken generations earlier was now measured by footsteps upon the earth. The Levites received no broad territory of land, for their inheritance was of a different kind. Their portion was the service of the sanctuary, the guardianship of worship, and the nearness to sacred presence. Not all inheritance is measured in acres. Some are measured in calling. Cities of refuge were established, places where mercy could stand beside justice. Within their walls, the pursued could find safety until truth was revealed. These cities became symbols that compassion was woven into the fabric of the covenant. As years passed, Yahusha summoned the tribes once more. The air carried the gravity of farewell. He recounted the journey from wilderness to possession, reminding them that every victory had flowed from obedience and every blessing from trust in Yahuwah. He warned them with clarity and compassion. Turn not aside, neither to the right nor to the left. The nations around them would entice, but covenant demanded steadfast hearts. Inheritance is preserved by vigilance as much as by valor. The people responded with unity of voice, pledging once again to serve Yahuwah. Their declaration echoed across hills and valleys, a chorus of commitment rising like incense before heaven. A great stone was set beneath an ancient tree as a witness to their vow. Silent yet enduring, it would outlast generations, reminding all who passed that promises spoken are promises remembered. In his final days, Yahusha's gaze stretched across the land he had helped secure. He had walked its plains as a soldier, its hills as a leader, and now viewed it as a steward nearing rest. His life became a bridge between promise and possession. When Yahusha was gathered to his fathers, the people mourned not only a leader, but a living testimony of faithfulness. The torch passed to new hands, yet the covenant flame remained unchanged. And so the narrative closes not with silence, but with continuation. The land stood as proof that promises endure beyond lifetimes. The legacy of Yahusha whispered through every field and stone. that obedience shapes destiny, remembrance sustains identity, and covenant binds generations from beginning to end. The land lay quiet beneath the evening sky, fields stretching where once armies marched. Time had softened the scars of war, yet memory preserved their meaning. The inheritance was secured, but inheritance alone does not guarantee faithfulness. Elders gathered beneath broad trees and within stone courts, recounting the journey from wilderness to promise. Stories became anchors, holding the hearts of a new generation who had not seen the parted waters nor the falling walls. For memory is a guardian of identity. Without remembrance, victories fade into myth, and covenant dissolves into tradition. The people were reminded that their strength was never in numbers, but in alignment with Yahuwah. Children listened with wide eyes as tales of courage, obedience, and divine intervention filled the air. Names once spoken on battlefields were now whispered beside hearth fires. History breathed through storytelling. Yet with prosperity came subtle danger. Comfort can dull vigilance, and abundance can blur devotion. The warning echoed gently yet firmly, "Forget not the source of your inheritance." Stone memorials stood weathered yet unbroken. Their silent presence testified louder than voices. They did not speak, yet they reminded every passerby that covenant is not a moment. It is a path walked daily. The priests continued their service, offering sacrifices and lifting prayers. Incense rose like threads of light into the heavens, weaving the past with the present, reminding all that worship sustains the soul. Travelers moved through the cities of refuge, merchants through markets, families through fields. Life flourished, yet beneath its rhythm lay an unseen responsibility to guard the covenant with both heart and action. The generations shifted like seasons. Faces changed, voices aged, but the promise remained constant. What had begun with a call to Abraham now stretched across centuries, carried by those willing to remember. Leaders reminded the people that the path forward required more than heritage. It required choice. Each sunrise offered the decision to walk in obedience or drift into forgetfulness. The land itself seemed to whisper the lessons of those who had walked before, that destiny is preserved by reverence, and blessing flows from alignment with the voice that guided them from the beginning. And so the journey continued, not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet resolve of hearts determined to remember. For a covenant remembered is a covenant alive, and a people who remember their source never walk alone. The land was settled, the tribes established, and memorial stones stood firm beneath sun and rain. Yet beneath the surface of peace flowed a deeper current, a promise older than conquest, older than kings, older even than the stones themselves. From the earliest days, whispers of redemption had moved through the generations. In the garden where humanity first fell, a word was spoken. Hope was planted at the dawn of sorrow, a word of a seed who would one day overcome the serpent's grasp. Through Abraham, the promise widened, a blessing that would reach all nations, not merely land, not merely lineage, but a future restoration written into the fabric of time. Moshe spoke of a prophet who would rise from among the people, one whose voice would carry authority beyond the mountains. His words lingered like distant thunder awaiting its storm. The psalmist sang of a king whose throne would endure beyond generations, whose reign would be marked by righteousness and peace. Their melodies carried both longing and certainty. Prophets beheld visions in fire-lit nights and storm-filled skies, a servant who would bear burdens, a ruler who would establish justice, a light that would pierce the deepest darkness. These were not scattered fragments, but threads woven into a single tapestry. Every promise converged toward a figure yet unseen. Every vision, every covenant line converged toward a figure yet unseen, but deeply known. The people preserved these words upon scrolls, teaching them to children and reciting them in assemblies. The future was remembered before it arrived, safeguarded by repetition and reverence. Empires would rise and fall, seasons would shift, and generations would pass. Yet the promise endured, not weakened by time, but strengthened by expectation. The land itself became a silent witness, its hills echoing ancient declarations, its valleys holding the footsteps of prophets. The covenant was not merely about possession of territory, it was about preparation of hearts. The inheritance of land foreshadowed the inheritance of restoration for all who would believe. And so the story stretched forward, like a road disappearing into golden light, the promise alive, the expectation unwavering. the world quietly moving toward the moment when prophecy would step into history and the long-awaited Redeemer would be revealed. Generations had carried the promise like a torch through darkness. Fathers spoke it to sons, mothers whispered it to daughters, and elders guarded it as sacred inheritance. Time moved forward, but expectation did not fade. The world itself seemed restless, as if creation sensed the approach of a turning point, written long before the mountains were raised. The air held anticipation, subtle yet undeniable. In quiet places, faithful hearts continued to watch. They studied the scrolls, counted the seasons, and lifted their eyes to the heavens, searching for signs written in light. Empires ruled with iron, cities grew loud with commerce, and cultures clashed in ambition. Yet beneath the noise, prophecy moved with silent precision toward its appointed hour. Then, in humility rather than thunder, the first glimmers of fulfillment appeared. Not in palaces of marble, not in halls of power, but in simplicity, a reminder that the eternal often works beyond human expectation. Messengers would speak, shepherds would listen, and distant travelers would follow a guiding light across endless night skies. The heavens themselves seemed to participate in the unveiling. The promise that had once been words upon parchment began to take on flesh and presence within the world. Hope was no longer distant theory. It stood at the threshold of reality. Those who watched with open hearts recognized the significance, while others continued unaware, their attention fixed upon the affairs of the day. Fulfillment often arrives quietly, before it is understood loudly. Ancient prophecies aligned like constellations, forming a recognizable image. The fragments of centuries converged into clarity, revealing a design too deliberate to be coincidence. Light pierced darkness, not as a flash of destruction, but as a steady dawn, gentle, persistent, impossible to halt. The world was changing, though many did not yet see it. The faithful sensed that history itself was bending toward restoration. What had been spoken by prophets and sung by psalmists was stepping onto the stage of time. And so the era of expectation gave way to the era of fulfillment. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of its most transformative chapter, where promise and reality would walk side by side beneath the same sky. The promise had entered the world, not as conquest, but as light walking among humanity. What generations longed to see had unfolded before ordinary eyes, yet its depth would take centuries to fully comprehend. Teachings spread from village paths to distant shores, carried not by armies but by voices transformed. Words once written on scrolls were now spoken from memory, engraved upon hearts rather than stone. Those who witnessed these days carried testimony like sacred fire. They traveled, endured hardship, and preserved the message so that future ages would not forget what had been revealed. Yet the world did not stand still. Kingdoms continued their rise and fall, cities expanded and collapsed, and humanity wrestled with its own nature, repeating cycles known since the earliest dawn. Through centuries of change, the message remained like a steady star above shifting seas. Cultures altered, languages evolved, but the essence of the promise endured untouched. Visionaries would continue to arise, reminding generations that fulfillment was not only an event of the past, but a living reality that called each soul to awareness. For the story was never meant to conclude in a single moment. It extended forward, inviting every era to examine itself in the mirror of truth and to choose the path of light over shadow. The scroll spoke not only of arrival, but of return, a restoration beyond human timelines. A horizon where justice and mercy would stand together without conflict. Signs in the heavens and movements upon the earth would stir hearts again, awakening the same watchfulness that once guided shepherds beneath ancient stars. The generations of the present now stand where many once stood before them, holding knowledge, possessing choice, and shaping the pages yet unwritten. The legacy is not preserved by memory alone, but by action, compassion, and truth lived openly. Each life becomes a verse added to an ever-unfolding narrative. And so the story closes not with silence, but with invitation to watch, to learn, to walk in wisdom, and to recognize that history moves toward restoration just as surely as dawn follows night. The river was crossed, the walls fell, the land was divided. What once seemed distant had become reality beneath their feet. Victories were not merely won by numbers, but by covenant remembered. The generation that stepped forward became the generation that inherited. Yet the story of conquest was never only about land. It was about identity, about remembering who they were and whose they were. Yahusha stood before the people and reminded them that inheritance without faithfulness becomes emptiness. The land was given, but the choice remained, to walk in wisdom or to forget the path that led them there. The story of Yahusha is not confined to time. It echoes wherever faith stands at the edge of uncertainty and chooses to step forward. And now, the question rests with you. When your moment to cross arrives, will you stand at the shore, or will you step into the promise?